They still hold up at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Israeli tanks are now in every major West Bank city except Hebron and Jericho. And the strong Israeli action has obviously brought some strong reaction from others in the world. The Vatican today released a statement by the Holy Father who condemned terrorist acts, but who also said that he rejects unjust conditions and humiliations imposed on the Palestinian people. We heard as well from the head of the European Union, who criticizes the United States for not getting more involved and says that now we need to stand aside and let other nations, read the Europeans, who are planning to send a delegation to the region, I think this week, let them step in and take over. Well, I've got to tell you, my reaction to the reaction of others who are criticizing Israel comes, I guess, from my own sense of the background of this conflict. I realize there are a lot of people who believe we need to talk about this like it's all taking place in some deep black hole of history where no light can get in from the past, but that's not true. I, at least, cannot help when I listen to all these folks and talking about what should or should not be done. I can't help but remember the facts from which this present situation comes. When the head of the European Union stands forward and tries to pretend that they have so much weight and credibility in addressing this problem, I can't help but remember that many Europeans sat on their hands and did nothing, while millions of Jews were slaughtered in the era that gave birth to the state of Israel. I can't help but remember that. When folks talk about the role that the international community should play, as the ambassador did here on my program last night, I can't help but remember that back in 1967, when the Arab forces were massing to launch a fateful death blow against Israel, Egyptian President Nasser kicked out the UN troops from the Sinai, demanded that they should go, and guess what? The international community didn't get its back up then and say, no, you can't launch this war of aggression. No, those so-called peacekeeping forces evaporated. And the international community sat by with bated breath as they waited for those hundreds of thousands of Arab troops to deliver a death blow that wasn't thwarted by international outrage. It was thwarted only by the unexpected and surprising brilliance of the Israeli military. And as a result of that brilliant victory in the Six-Day War, Israel acquired territory, the Sinai, the West Bank, Gaza. And it wasn't a war of conquest. That's one of the things that is so often said these days, where folks seem to either forget history or be lying through their teeth, giving the impression that somehow this is illegitimate. Israel just moved in and conquered these hapless people. It's a lie. Those territories were acquired in the course of a desperate war for survival. And the international community, by the way, so-called, doesn't react to every such control of territory as if it's somehow illegitimate. Consider, for instance, the situation between China and India right up to the present day. China moves in, takes a chunk of territory from India back in 1962, holds on to it right now as a result of that war. And who is out there bleating about how the Chinese are occupying this territory and so forth? The very most you can get from them is that it's disputed on many maps. It's not even marked that way. And what is the assumption? Well, the assumption always has been you get territory as a result of such a war. You don't give it up, except in the context of a negotiated peace. And unlike the Chinese, the Israelis have shown themselves willing time and time again to put that territory on the line in the hopes of achieving just such a negotiated settlement. And not only that, they have done so. The historic Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt in 1978 resulted in Israel's return of the Sinai to the Egyptians. An agreement made, an agreement kept. We've also seen agreements between Israel and Jordan, between Israel quietly and Syria even, regulating the ceasefire arrangements on the Golan Heights. In areas where the other side is willing to keep its word, history shows that Israel has also kept its word, and that agreements that were hammered out through great difficulty and often with a lot of courage, where there were reciprocal understandings, when the other side was willing to meet its obligations, Israel did the same. Why are we forgetting this now? Why are we talking about this like all this takes place in some kind of a vacuum where there is no experience to guide our understanding of the way in which we should be looking at and reacting to events right now? The difference, it seems to me, in the track record between Israel and Yasser Arafat, Israel and negotiations with the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, is that in spite of agreement after agreement after agreement, in which all kinds of declarations are made and statements are made, the Israelis have, in fact, made concessions, made agreements, signed on the dotted line, followed through on those agreements, as they did when they turned authority in the West Bank and Gaza over to Yasser Arafat as a result of such an agreement. But in spite of agreement in 1993 in Oslo, in spite of the Camp David efforts, we have seen what kind of progress? Oh, yeah, there's been lip service paid. There have been statements, yes, we'll accept the existence of Israel coming from Yasser Arafat and others. And meanwhile, the one thing that was required of their side never been delivered, and that is to stop killing Israelis. That's all. Just stop the killing, stop the violence. Let the discussions take place in an environment where one isn't trying to manipulate the process through that kind of death-dealing destruction. And now, of course, people reacting to the present situation like all that history never occurred. Like Yasser Arafat never moved into those territories, never took over. Like the effort at NY River never took place, where the Israelis actually laid on the line 90% of what he wanted. And he storms out because he doesn't get 100%, including full control of Jerusalem. And the right of return, the demand for which, by the way, belies the statement that these folks are willing to accept a Jewish state of Israel. No. I, for one, can't forget all these things. I know everybody's inviting us to look upon this as if there is no reason to recall the history, no reason to remember the facts, but I, for one, can't help but remember them. And I, for one, also can't help but look at the reality of the situation that Israel faces, even as we do right now. In their statement, for instance, out of the Vatican, they were talking about Israel's actions as if they consisted of reprisals and vengeance. I've even seen reporters talking about Israeli anger and so forth and so on. I don't think their policy comes from anger, any more than our policies right now, in response to the terrible terrorist attacks on us, come from a thirst for revenge. I haven't seen it. No, but it does come from a necessary ability to think through the implications of the death-dealing blows that have come against you. It's one of the problems with suicide bombings and suicide terrorism, such as we ourselves have suffered from. And that problem is simple and that problem is clear. The perpetrator just blew himself up, just imposed on himself the death penalty. No feckless talk about going after the perpetrators is going to be enough in this case. No defensive action will actually forestall the death-dealing blow unless you go up against those who have incited and encouraged and equipped and financed those who are determined to kill you. We've understood that in the policy we have pursued. Why is it that so many folks are unwilling to see the same imperative in the policies that the Israelis are now pursuing? It seems to me that to react to these events as if history never happened and as if reality doesn't have to be dealt with doesn't make a contribution to peace, because peace can't be built on a foundation of manipulation and deception and lies. No lasting peace is going to come as a result of that kind of false foundation. And those who think so are not only fooling themselves, they are deluding all those folks who are, in fact, suffering in the Middle East. I know some people will conclude, oh, Alan, you're just pro-Israeli. You hate the Palestinians. Nothing of the kind. I was among the first, long before this administration did it, to understand and declare the need to recognize and accept the legitimate demand for Palestinian self-government. I still deeply believe in it. But the first prerequisite of self-government is that one govern one's own passions, one's own resentment and anger and violence. That's the first prerequisite of self-government. I learned that from Martin Luther King, because I don't think any progress would have been made in this country, except he stood up and understood that even when one sees oneself as the victim of terrible oppression, you still have to take responsibility to make sure you don't make a contribution to the very cycle of violence that destroys and oppresses you. That is the kind of leadership that the Palestinian people right now need. It's the kind of leadership they deserve. It's not the kind of leadership they're getting. Instead, they're getting leadership that pushes them into desperate acts of self-destruction. I think that self-destruction symbolizes all that they have to offer. Stand up, throw yourself into the pit, give yourself to the void of despair. What will it accomplish? Except that you will be an immolation sacrificed on the altar of prideful leaders who apparently don't have the ability to think through the positive approach that can actually diffuse and undermine the cycle of violence and open the path to real peace and progress. There have been leaders like that. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, others. They understood that you could not quell violence by yourself becoming an instrument of mindless violence, including the evil violence against the innocent. I find it hard to believe that folks on our side, including the president himself, are deluding themselves into thinking that we'll make progress if we can just get Yasser Arafat to tell us one more lie about how he'll renounce violence while he goes on encouraging it, declaring that he wants, like others, to be a martyr to the cause. Well, I think that it would be wiser in his case if instead of trying to be a martyr to violence, you know what the word martyr means? It means witness. Oh, I think that the Palestinian people don't need more witnesses to violence, more witnesses to the incitement to reprisal and revenge and further outrage. I think what they need is some witnesses to hope. Some folks who will actually understand. They should look at the record with Egypt, with Jordan, with others. Israel has, in fact, been willing to keep a deal made if the other side lives up to its side of the bargain. That is an offer of hope. And the way to put people on the spot when they show that kind of a willingness is to back away from the cycle of violence, even if you see it come against you, as certainly people who were my ancestors in this country did see it come against them. But those who led our way to progress against a system of oppression understood that if you, the victim, surrender to that violence, you feed it, you fuel it, until it burns up not only the ones that you may hate, but you yourself. I think the people of the Middle East deserve a better fate than that kind of self-immolation. But I don't think they're going to get it until they are able to understand that when leaders are pushing you over the desperate precipice of revenge and self-destruction, you shouldn't reject life. You should reject that leadership. I think we'll offer some hope and progress to folks in that part of the world when we ourselves have the courage to stand up, look them in the eye, and make it clear that we're not going to be throwing our weight into the scales until we see a willingness on all sides to take responsibility for an end to the cycle of violence, just as I have outlined it. And that means all sides, including the Palestinians, including the Arabs, including all of those who have pleaded victimization to excuse their surrender to evil. That's not going to serve the purposes of justice and peace. The past suggests, and we can't forget it, that only fuels further destruction. I think that our leadership in this country and elsewhere in the world, all these people think we want to have compassion, we want to spare these people suffering. You're not going to spare them suffering by coddling that leadership which is seeking quite consciously to incite them to this self-destruction. Shut the door in their face. Make it clear that the world will have no truck with them anymore. And then, with that toughness, you will open the door to hope. You will force the people who are involved to lift up from their midst leaders who will offer them something better than those who are now offering only this pointless destruction of the innocent. I think that that's the real key. And I think that we need to have, as Americans, as others who are hoping and praying that this situation will somehow or another be open to a path of peace, we need to have the guts to show that toughness. Because the phony compassion that coddles the violence is only going to do exactly what the suicide bombers do. Destroy themselves and everything else along with it. And I don't think that's good enough. I don't think that shows concern for the Palestinians, for the Israelis, for the region, for the world, or anyone else. And if we don't show that kind of courage, if we give in to the feckless demands of the Europeans or anybody else, that we should somehow surrender now a position of integrity which demands an end to this suicidal violence, then instead of offering hope, we will have joined in with those forces of despair. Well, that's how I see it. Up next, we are going to be talking about an initiative in the Congress aimed, I think, at empowering the president to demand just this kind of responsible leadership. And a bill before the House that would let the president impose sanctions on Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority. Some people on Capitol Hill think that it should be supported. We'll talk to one congressman who's sponsoring the legislation and to a Palestinian who strongly disagrees with it. Plus, your thoughts on the Middle East. You can call me tonight at 1-866-KEYS-USA. We're going to be taking your phone calls again, so put the number down, call in, 1-866-KEYS-USA. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Blankly of the Washington Times. He actually wrote an editorial today, which was about the criticism that Mr. Bush has come in for, saying that criticizing critics who include myself, I suppose, who have said that the policy toward the Middle East is incoherent. Well, being one of those critics, I am going to take him on in the next half hour, so you stay tuned. A reminder, too, that the chat room is humming tonight. Greg in Ohio says the Palestinians have been kicked to the curb by every other Arab country. They are being used as pawns in a broader attack on Israel. You can join in right now at chat.msnbc.com. But first, there's a move in Congress to give the president the power to punish Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority if they continue these acts of violence in violation of their pledged word given in the context of the accords in 1993. One of the bills is sponsored by Democratic Congressman Gary Ackerman of New York. In it, the president would be allowed to deny visas to Palestinian officials, close the PLO office in the United States, designate the PLO as a terrorist organization, and prohibit U.S. aid to the West Bank and Gaza, except for humanitarian assistance. Congressman Ackerman joins us now. He is also a member of the International Relations Committee and the ranking member of the House Subcommittee on the Middle East. Also with us, Ramsey Abdallah, a member of the Palestinian American Congress, a group that fights for the humanitarian rights of Palestinians. Gentlemen, welcome to Making Sense.
Thank you. Thank you.
Congressman, I want to start first with you. You have put this bill forward before. I think it enjoys broad support in the Congress. Do you think in the present circumstances and environment that something like this would appropriately empower the president and increase his ability to deal with the situation?
I think so. It's very realistic. I think what it does is it requires the president to make an evaluation as to whether or not the Palestinian Authority is meeting all of its commitments, starting with Oslo and going right down to the last thing that they signed. And if he makes a determination that they're not, then these sanctions become imposed unless the president feels that it's in the national security interest not to. But the president must make that determination, and we have support on both sides of the aisle.
But what do you think would be the consequences of taking that kind of a step? I mean, you must realize that there are those, including in certain of his personalities, the Secretary of State Colin Powell, who seem to think that Yasser Arafat's the indispensable man. You can't really do anything that would suggest that you're not going to deal with him and with the Palestinian Authority. Don't you think that in the face of that kind of criticism, this sort of a bill might send the wrong message?
No, I think it sends the right message. As a matter of fact, I met with Yasser Arafat back in August, and he brought up the fact that I had sponsored this bill, and we had a pretty lively discussion about it. Alan, as far as I'm concerned, the time has come to deny the lie that we must be even-handed. There is no such thing as an even-handed approach to a terrorist and a victim. We have to call the shots the way they are and deal with it the way it is.
Now, Ramsey Abdallah, this sort of a move in the U.S. Congress that would seek to impose a penalty on Yasser Arafat, on the Palestinian Authority, if the acts of violence continue, what do you think this would do to the situation in the Middle East?
Well, if you wanted to escalate the situation to a whole nother level where you would have a regional conflict, I guess you would go ahead and say, let us impose a sanction. There has been a greater sanction imposed by America and the U.S. Congress already giving the green light to Sharon and to the Israeli Defense Forces to operate as they wish in Ramallah and into the occupied territories. I absolutely agree 100% with Senator Ackerman and he say that these allegations that we're not even-handed, you can't have an even-handed Congress, that's absolutely 100% correct, due to the fact that we have seen time and time and again that the Congress favors any bills and any issues that are posed before the Congress concerning Israeli interests.
Alan, I just have to say something. What Ramsey just said is absolutely outrageous. To claim that if the U.S. expresses its opinion and deals with who they want and doesn't deal with who they don't want to deal with, that this is going to lead to more violence and rev up the action. That is an unconscionable thing to say.
Is it really absurd, Senator, the fact that the Congress has supported and has passed a resolution that says that the U.S. Embassy should be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Is it really an allegation, or has it really been proposed and passed as a resolution that the U.S. shall move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Excuse me, Alan Keyes, let me finish up 1 second, please. Now, with this allegation here, I would like to point out that these are occupied lands that have been occupied lands, and they have been recognized by the U.S. and the international communities
Hold
to
on.
be occupied territory.
Hold on.
Why would
Before you move the subject to another area, I think we need to focus on this question of responsibility for violence. Because one of the problems that I see in the response that you and others give is that you want to say, well, the U.S. gave the green light to violence. No, the suicide bombers gave the green light to violence. The people who continually come into the midst of innocent people and kill them, they have given the green light to a response aimed at stopping this kind of destruction.
How convenient it is for you to cut me off in the middle of my speech so that you may be heard. That is quite uncandid of a person who is even dealing, as you put it, to try to go ahead and cut off a person that you have invited to pursue a point of view from the Palestinian aspect.
If you are not going to respect the protocols of the program, I will respect the fact that I am a Palestinian. Cut him off. This is one of the problems. See, I want to take the floor for a minute because this is one of the problems. I think that it's precisely this kind of attitude that is killing people in the Middle East. I have moderated many discussions in the course of this program. It does require that one person listen to other people and not constantly talk over them, as you were just doing. That verbal violence reflects the very kind of dictatorial violence that apparently it is the strategy of Palestinians to impose on this process by any means necessary. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work in the world, and it's not going to work on this program.
Alan,
because I'll tell you straight in the front, if G.W. Bush doesn't have the courage to stand up and say won't tolerate it, then I have the courage to say it on this program. I won't tolerate it.
Alan?
Because I think that it's absolutely out of line. I'll give folks a chance to have their say, but you're going to engage in a conversation or you won't engage. If you think that kind of verbal violence will win here, you're wrong, any more than it would win if I had an opportunity to do something about it in the world at large. Representative Ackerman, I'm sorry, I can't but see a problem right here reflected. How is one to encourage a constructive discussion when one side is continually trying, by violent and overbearing means, to shut down the other?
Alan Keyes, you're making sense. Let me tell you, you've put your finger on the problem. There are those who think that just because they have a point of view, their point of view has to win, and they will go to any means, use any kind of instrumentality at their disposal, including filibustering on somebody's show, including sending young people in to blow themselves up, to prove that they are right when they have a...
Mr. Alan Keyes and Senator, I would like to go ahead and point out that Mr. Alan Keyes has portrayed nothing but one-sidedness in this whole discussion. In his efforts to become an even-handed dealer, he has become a bigot, in fact.
Well, why don't you
I would like to go ahead and tell you that for you to make allegations that say that I am here portraying this through a violent nature, I am trying to be heard, whereas you are going and cutting me off. Senator Ackerman, I have the greatest and deepest respect for you, and I would like to go ahead and converse with you.
I would like to do that too, but you're filibustering.
Sir, I am not filibustering. I am here to make a point. However, Mr. Keyes doesn't see a need for me to make that point.
That's not true.
Therefore, he goes in and cuts in every chance that he gets.
He cuts me off too. He's the moderator. It's his show.
A matter of fact, I let you make your point. I then turned to I turned to the congressman. I let you make your point. While he was speaking, you were speaking over him.
That's because you cut me in the middle of my point, Mr. Alan Keyes.
You then, as I think is happening right now in the process, you want to dictate the terms.
Oh, absolutely not.
No,
if you were to leave this as a discussion between myself and the congressman, I guarantee you it would be a discussion that people would like.
Addressing that point. And not only that, but the sad thing that I've encountered over the years as well is that when folks get into this kind of a situation, they immediately start the ad hominem name calling and all this junk. Doesn't work with me. I'm sorry.
Sir, the reason that it doesn't work with you is because it is true. I am not name calling. I am consistently telling you exactly where your point of view is coming from and how your point of view is. And I will not stand for this, for you to stand there and to diminish the efforts of the PLO and of the situation at large. You have self-proclaimed yourself as a Middle East expert. You do not have the expertise to contact or to even speak about the Middle East.
Alan, I have done nothing to the Palestinian organization. Yes, sir, for everybody else.
What you have bashed it for the past week.
This is exactly
what you failed to recognize. Just 1 minute, Congressman. What you failed to recognize, Mr. Abdallah, is that the violence being perpetrated in the Middle East against the innocent is what is doing the greatest harm possible to the Palestinian cause.
I agree with you. You know what? Why don't we stop the violence on the Israeli Defense Forces side? Why don't you mention the fact that there have been executions taking place in the streets for the past week? Why have I not seen that on the news? Why haven't I heard that from your mouth? Instead, last night, in a heated debate between you and Mr. Clovis, you had mentioned that it's simply a war. They lost the land in 1967, and that's it. If you are to be the next generation of leaders, I seriously fear for the hope of peace in this country and in other countries around the world.
If I may say something, there is violence and there is a reaction to violence. It's not the same thing. You don't have Israelis going in and blowing themselves up in people's schools and people's restaurants. You have Israelis going in and trying to root out the terrorists. The way they're supposed to do that.
People's homes, Senator?
Yeah, why don't you interrupt me also?
Go right ahead, sir. I will go ahead and comment, because this is an open discussion, sir.
I think I was talking. Don't be rude, please.
Oh, please. I am not being rude. I am being well within my concerns here. You are addressing an issue. I am commenting on it.
Because nobody's allowed to talk on the show but you.
If you would like to go ahead and continue, please.
No, I want to make the points that I'm trying to make.
Go right ahead, sir.
And that is, there is no cycle of violence. There is a reaction to violence. And a reaction to violence is strong. And it has to be strong, because people have to know that if they're going to act in a violent way, they're going to pay the price. The deal was land for peace. If you take away the peace, you're not going to have the land. The Israelis, from the very beginning, after the victor won the spoils, after they were attacked by most of the Arab world surrounding them, they won.
Congressman,
they took this territory and they did not annex it.
Congressman,
they
we have come up against the time limit. I really appreciate both of you coming on the program today and helping us both to understand a little bit, but also to illustrate a good deal. I think one of the reasons why so little progress is right now being made in the Middle East. Well, next, many have criticized President Bush for not having a coherent Mideast policy. Columnist Tony Blankley says that's not fair. Well, I've been one of the critics. I'm going to take him on.